Hello, so I have with me today Abi Mann, and I'm very excited to discuss with her her project on stammering. And National Stammering Day is coming up on Saturday, and
Yeah.
Abi has conducted an excellent project on this subject, which she is hoping to get published. It's certainly good enough to get published. So, Abi, before we move into your project, can you just give us a bit of background and tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to the project in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So I had done a psychology degree, frighteningly, almost about 20 years ago now. And alongside that, I was training to be a singer. And I had in my mind about potentially music therapy. But life kind of got in the way. And in the interim, I'd built up a private teaching practice. So I specialize in holistic one-to-one singing lessons. And I was finding that the kind of students that were coming to me were very much people who were struggling in some way with some kind of health condition, be it mental or physical. And I was really believing on a personal level as well as a professional that there was a therapeutic benefit to education and learning about your voice and learning about music. And I luckily came across the Voice Study Centre and began studying along the Singing for Health pathway on the MA. And around about the same time, a student joined who had a very profound, persistent stammer. I'd had students who stammer before come. And I was incredibly lucky because she actually took a real interest in what I was studying and said, do you think that you could help me with my voice? And I'm very much not a expert on all the biology and all the different parts of the voice, although, you know, I know what I need to know, but I wasn't about how can I fix the stammer or eliminate it or reduce it. It was just, how can I help my student have a happier relationship with her voice? Because definitely over the last 20 years that I've been teaching, I have found that if people have the confidence to sing and that they build a confidence of using their voice, that it follows through different areas of their life. So the person that comes to me who is scared of singing and then learns an entire song and manages to have the courage to sing it for themselves, most importantly, maybe sing it to their friends or family, will be the same person who speaks up at work if they're not happy, or the same person who will speak up at the doctor's surgery or with their friends or family if they're not happy. And I've heard so much anecdotal evidence of, well, I used my voice, I felt confident to use it. So it was that kind of thread that had been running through the last few years that made me think, you know, my student's got a beautiful voice. If she could have the confidence to sing more. I just had the question that, could singing lessons help her improve the relationship she's got with her voice?
Yeah. And so this then led you into doing a real deep dive into the literature.
Yes.
And what did you find? Is it worth maybe as well clarifying what a stammer is? Is it something that's misunderstood? Are there lots of perceptions around the notion of what a stammer is? And can you tell us about that?
So a stammer is really defined as an interruption of speech. So you can have delays in time. There's no known cause, but I think the general consensus is that it's rooted in neurological origins rather than psychological. So there's a lot of myths about stammering, about it being a case of somebody being really nervous and anxious, when that could absolutely not be the case at all. And what I did find is that I really wanted to educate myself on what the literature was telling us about stammering, but I also was hearing so much different language. And I think that happens a lot with any neurodiversity. You get so many different terms and terminology. So my first question was, well, what's a stutter and what's a stammer? And I found that they're basically the same. It's describing the same thing. And you will have some people who are more sort of person identified, and they'll say, I am a stammerer. And then other people will prefer to be identified as the person first, and I have a stammer. So it's an interruption of speech. You can sometimes have like tics or physical symptoms that come along with it as well, that's not just vocally. But you can have a stammer that is incredibly rare, that will just come out very, very occasionally. And you can also have a stammer that's so severe that speech is absolutely terrifying.
And so then when you kind of took that deep dive into the literature, what were the common themes that came out? So how did it change your perception, and what did you learn most from that from just the literature?
Yeah, just from the literature, I was really struck by how much shame and avoidance it brings for people. So some people don't work. They believe it's impacted their relationships. And there's been a lot of literature about, I think, primarily male stammerers. That could be because I think the general statistics that there are more men stammerers than women. But there seems to be an awful lot of shame and self-identity wrapped up. You know, we identify ourselves with our voice, and our whole self is wrapped up in voice for all of us. But what I was also finding was in the literature, certainly in the last couple of years or so, that women really tend to have the voice wrapped up with the identity, perhaps even more so than men. But of course, that's a whole other conversation about gender stereotypes and everything. But that was really interesting. There's long-term psychosocial effects of stammering, anxiety, depression, and lifelong. I mean, my student's 60, and she's had it since she was 6, and the literature was, a lot of stammerers, of children, they grow out of it, but the adults kind of get a bit forgotten about, I think. And they've lived a life of stammering, and there's an awful disparity, I think, about the quality of life being so much lower for them, just because society isn't fully accepting.
And so what's the connection between singing and stammer? Because I know there's also a lot of misconceptions around that. So
yeah, there is. So it's so exciting and interesting, and we don't fully understand it yet. But as a general rule, if somebody stammers in speech, that won't translate to singing. I say as a general rule because I have actually seen people stammer in singing. So it's not impossible, but it's fairly rare. And one theory is that it's to do with the rhythm. So you can ask somebody to do say a tongue twister in singing, you'd warm up by saying the tip of the tongue, the teeth and the lips. And that would be really challenging for a stammerer to say. But if you then said the tip of the tongue, the teeth and the lips, the tip of the tongue, the teeth and the lips, and you made them sing it, all of a sudden that feels freeing, and they can sing without any disruption. So I think some of it's to do with the rhythm, the melody. And I also wonder if it's a case of, if you're singing a song and you've got the words there, there's a different neurological thing going on there, because you're not having to think, like I'm talking to you now, all the while I'm thinking about what my next word's going to say, or what my next word's going to be. But if I was singing a song to you, I would know the words. Hopefully I would know the words that were coming. So I do wonder if there's that as well. But it's something that has been of interest for such a long time. I came across somebody at the weekend at the biopsychosocial conference, and her grandpa had had a stammer, and he had written an article in the 1920s about his singing teacher helping him to just have confidence in his voice by singing. And of course, there being no disruption when he's singing.
And so this obviously gave you the rationale for this project.
Yeah.
And also you saw a gap in the literature as well, didn't you? So
yeah,
I guess there is a gap there.
Yeah, so there's lots about people that stammer when they speak, don't necessarily when they sing. There's lots about that. There's lots about singing, building our confidence in our voice. And there's lots about the relationship with our voice being really complex. But I couldn't find research about, well, what if people who stammer are given an opportunity to explore the relationship they have with their voice through singing?
And so then within your project, you then decide, what I really enjoyed reading was just the practitioner insight as to how you took that knowledge regarding almost stammer informed knowledge to build a stammer sensitive lesson, which I thought was just extraordinary. So you didn't kind of just wade in doing an ordinary singing lesson. So can you just tell us a little bit about your processes and a bit about how you put that lesson together, and what the evidence base was for your, as much as you can do within the time limit, but within that, how you selected those different elements, and maybe clarify the evidence base for those elements.
Yeah, so because I looked at 3 different sections, which was the lived experiences of stammering, the therapeutic singing, and the psychological impact of stammering. The literature from those 3 areas gave me 3 distinct anchors by which all the content of my lesson was formed. So the 3 anchors were mindfulness, or compassion-based mindfulness, self-soothing tools, and therapeutic singing. And the self-soothing tools were based on grounding exercises that the literature had informed me helps to self-soothe when people are in distress about stammering. So there were those relaxation and grounding exercises that I kind of fed through into the lesson at the beginning and end to kind of foster that relaxed state. The therapeutic singing was kind of informed by my years of practice, and it kind of got, I suppose, validated by the literature. So the therapeutic singing would be involving breath work. The breath work was based on the accent method by Ron Morris that's used in speech and language therapy. Then there was vocal play, and musical play, which is used a lot in trauma-informed practice, and voice pedagogy. And then the, just trying to think of the other one, the therapeutic singing. Oh, the mindfulness. The mindfulness kind of fed through the whole lesson, but it began with a self-awareness check-in towards just before the vocalization and just after, just to encourage awareness of what's going on in the whole body. So that sounded a bit convoluted, but
no, it doesn't at all. I think what it shows is that you've really taken time to explore, from your knowledge of the information and your knowledge of the stammer, to explore appropriate sort of methodologies that themselves have an appropriate evidence base for. And obviously mindfulness and accent method, that's quite a big that's quite a lot there you must have waded through to put that together. So, you know, in terms from a practitioner perspective, I think that's really quite fascinating.
Yes, and it was something that was very much a cyclical thing, because halfway through I was realizing elements of my teaching that I hadn't really focused on as much in the past, but suddenly came more to light because of the feedback I was getting. So for instance, a lot in traditional singing lessons, I make sure the focus is on my student's voice, not mine. But I was realizing that for my student, she really benefited from having a second voice to sing alongside with, as almost like a companion. And she felt like it was almost a musical holding of another voice being there. So I realized halfway through I need to do more duet or harmony work or join in. So that was really interesting from the practitioner side of things for me.
Yes, really interesting links with the trauma-informed work.
Yeah,
I know the work of Lisa Monti, that she looks at vocal holding, and so some really interesting links there as well.
yeah.
So when you put that together, and then obviously you took it, you implemented it in a single case study. So obviously,
Yes.
methodologically, we're not saying that there's any generalizability, should we, heaven forbid we should ever suggest that. But there, what came out was what I particularly liked about it, you've got a dual-pronged data set, qualitative data set of their emotions towards their stammer and their emotions towards your lessons. And it kind of made me shiver a bit when I read it. It was very, very moving. So can you tell us about your first data set, which was the emotions that they have towards that your case study had towards their own voice?
So yeah, so I did a thematic analysis. There were 10 themes. It was a huge project, but the key that was coming out of this was my students' emotions and feelings to her voice. When she was speaking, she would use words like terror, shame, fear, I don't have a voice, exhausted. But when she described how she felt about her voice when she was singing, it was blissful, freeing, I have a voice, power. And it really made me stop in my tracks, because I thought, this is the same voice. It's the same voice bringing about polar opposite emotions being used in different ways. So it really made me think that the voice that brought about all this terror and shame and fear when speaking actually also made her feel empowered and strong and blissful. And I looked through her reflections. We did a creative reflection after each lesson, and she chose creative writing. So I would read through the reflections. And what was lovely was I could see a sort of gentle evolution, where at the beginning of the lessons, she was feeling shame about her speech, but enjoying her singing. And by the end, she was realizing that the singing lesson gave her an opportunity to speak as well as sing. and that because we spoke about, you know, what part of the lessons of most benefit. And it was just really moving, I think, to see her reflect as she went along and think, actually, I'm able to speak in the lessons. And yes, I stammer, but it's accepted and it's a safe space. And that voice that's frightened me for so long also gives me huge joy. So that was quite moving.
Yeah, I think so. I think when I read it, I think that polarity, and I was really quite impressed that you did that. Actually, I think that was such a great thing to do, to explore her emotions towards her own voice before you simply moved into how she was reacting to your lessons. I think that gave a real depth and richness to the project. And certainly as you know, somebody that was really learning from you as a reader, and as well linking back to the literature review and how really linked, you know, those themes were being echoed through from previous studies as well. So the corroboration there between that, your work and what had come before. I think that gave it a real rich context. So in terms of how the themes, in terms of the response to your lessons, I know you've touched on it briefly, but can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there was the environment, which seems like a strange thing to bring up, but it was something I wasn't expecting. I have a sort of home music studio, and I try really hard for it to be professional and yet welcoming. And I realized how important the space is. And, you know, my student kept saying throughout the whole process, verbally and written down, that she feels it's a safe space. It feels like she's come home. She was sensitive to the colors and the lighting. And it even got to the point where she was confident enough to say through one of the lessons that she didn't like one of the positioning of the lights, and that really brought to mind about, you know, good practice and in teaching. There was also the student-teacher relationship. I was very aware, especially being a practitioner researcher and an insider researcher, and being the facilitator as well as the researcher, that our relationship could be the sort of the driving force of this enhanced relationship to her voice. But we made that part of the data and we made that a real discussion point. And I think the teacher-student relationship is really key, but I don't think that should be a reason for not exploring this further, because I think it gives, hopefully, the insight of what could potentially evolve between a singing teacher and a student. So yeah, there was that. Trying to think of all my themes. There were so many of them. There was, sorry, Debbie. Just pausing for a moment while I think.
I think one of the interesting ones for me was about, like you said before, you hinted at it before, where it became more of a holistic voice. She saw her voice in a different way.
She saw it as the whole voice, which was actually a huge thing for me as well, because, you know, I've been singing professionally for 20 years and I still was saying the speaking voice and my singing voice. And I realized halfway through, no, this is the whole voice, which is also something that had been mentioned in the literature. So that was really, really insightful. And I think that's what my student had realized, in that, oh, this is my whole voice and I can use it in a strong way.
Which really has implications really almost more broadly then, because we do we almost savagely dichotomize the voice, don't we? As if to say, and I wonder sometimes whether that's almost a you can play, you can play, you can play, you can sing, you can't sing. And so
Yes.
this sung voice, spoken voice kind of boom. And we do in education as well. And
Yeah.
we're as guilty in terms of the syllabi that we run as much as anybody else on that. It's really interesting, isn't it? Do you think it has
Yeah.
those implications? Or
Yeah, I just think the language that we use, and I've kept, especially over the summer, and with a lot of my younger students, I've really kind of driven home, this is your whole voice. And I can see, certainly in my studio, I can see a shift happening in their mentality, and I think that's really powerful. And I've really kind of taken myself to task over it. I had COVID last month and I was quite poorly with it, and I'm speaking fine, but my singing isn't great. So now I'm really conscious to say to my students, my voice is healing well, but when it sings, it struggles a bit, rather than my singing voice isn't great, but my speaking voice is okay. And it can seem like it's a small linguistic thing, but we know how powerful language is, and it can position ourselves differently, you know. And another theme that came up was self-identity, which had also come up in the literature. Sally, my student, it's a pseudonym, but she didn't think that when she spoke, it was a representation of who she was inside. But she did think that when she sung, it was a representation of who she was inside. And I think that's really quite deep when one considers that's, you know, that's the same voice. It's her same voice that's representing who she is.
yeah,
Just used in a different way.
absolutely. No, it's certainly a profound read for sure. And so when you had no idea when you took this on, you had no idea the journey that you're about to go on, and so it's been a real journey for you, which is wonderful. I know you took it more broadly externally to, was it the Stammering Society? You took it, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the British Stammering Association, which is called Stammer, had a very large conference in the summer, and it was affiliated with the International Stammering Association. They had their congress, and Stammer had their biannual conference, and they fused it together. It was 4 days in Liverpool, and it was incredibly powerful, I think, for everybody who attended that conference. Just so powerful to have hundreds of people in the same space, all feeling free to be their whole selves and not having to hide or not be 100% them. And I led 2 sessions there. I led a singing workshop, which was based on the content of the lessons that we'd done in the case study, but with a different song. And then I did a presentation of my research on the following day. So if people were interested in the singing workshop, if they had fun at the singing workshop, but they wanted to know the theory behind it, they could come along to my talk the next day. And that was really, really lovely to sort of take it out to a wider. I was very scared for 2 reasons. One, it was my first conference where I was running workshops and speaking. But 2, it was a research that was so close to my heart. I wanted to do my student justice. I was really scared that I wasn't going to do her justice. And I thought it was really important, but I had no idea if anybody else would be interested, because it is, like you say, it's new ground. But I got really positive feedback. And that
I can imagine that you did. I mean, the report itself, just academically, was very well executed. It was very, very, very ethically done, actually. I think it really, what struck me was just like the depth and the ethical very well thought out ethical premise of it. So I can imagine it was very well received. And in terms of where it goes now, what next?
Well, I'm in my final year of my MA with you, and I would really like for my final project to be a development of this. So as you said, it was a case study, it was a pilot really. I was really scared starting it actually, Debbie, because I didn't know what would come at the end of it. I didn't know if I was going to find that actually my singing lessons weren't actually going to have any kind of benefits. So I was being really thrilled by the whole process. And I think in order to kind of explore the reliability or the transferability of this, I'd love to develop it so that I could deliver the singing lessons to other stammerers who don't know me. So we don't have that established relationship of trust already, that we can just start new purely on this singing lesson design. And to maybe add that I'm a real qualitative researcher at heart, but it would be nice to maybe mix it with quantitative to maybe measure self-esteem or anxiety or confidence around the voice, and to maybe measure that before and after the singing lessons, just to see if there's anything further I could help develop with that.
And
so
do you
that's
think
my
you would
hope.
add, is there another dimension that you would add to those lessons?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I'm thinking on at the moment, mainly because the lessons with my student Sally, even though I knew her because she was a student at my studio, I still did a informal discussion, sort of semi-structured interview at the beginning to get some context. So I don't feel like, even though I'm confident in the delivery of the singing lesson program, I don't feel like I could just meet somebody and go, right, let's deliver it. There'd need to be some kind of pre-meeting and getting to know one another first. And there's also the logistics of the fact that, geographically speaking, is this something that I go to? And if so, I don't have full control over the environment. Or is this something we do online, and then online adds another dimension to it?
I suppose you'd be able to access
that.
a greater sample, wouldn't you, if you did it online?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Lots to think about.
Yeah.
Lots to think about. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
great to speak. So interesting to hear you actually talk through your processes with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.